Hello everyone. Bear with me, this is my first attempt at recording something like this all on my own. And I'm probably going to cock it all up before I'm all done. But let's hope. Let's hope. Anyway, my name is Joan, and I'm the storyteller on Charismatoac for our Werewolf the Apocalypse 20th Anniversary Edition campaign called A Song Atara. I am going to do a couple of videos, maybe more than a couple, we'll see as it goes along, about the campaign and why I do things the way I do, how I come up with my ideas. So just a bit of background for everyone listening out there, and obviously since my players are undoubtedly going to listen into this, I'm not going to give away any kind of secrets as to the campaign, so this will be spoiler free. A little bit about me to begin with. As I said, my name is Joan. I have been playing role-playing games for more than 30 years now. I am a resident of and citizen of Denmark, in Scandinavia, for those of you who might be listening from all over the place. No, Denmark is in fact not the capital of Oslo. Look it up. However, over those many years of role-playing, I have been both a player and a storyteller, or a GM, or whatever title you wish to give to it. I've probably tried it at one point or another. Hell, I've even been involved in a very low-grade kind of way in a bit of games design when I was quite a bit younger than I am now. And over the course of these years, I've obviously I've gotten into the habit of doing things in a certain way and according to certain methods, and well, most people who play with me would probably agree with me if I said that I am not very big on rules, and I'm very big on story. I'm very big on the narrative of a campaign. Those are not necessarily the same thing. Story and narrative are not necessarily the same thing. I can get into that in a future episode. But those are the things I'm into. Rules and systems for me are definitely secondary. I prefer to tell the story and be damned the rules if they get in the way. Within reason. If one of my players suddenly decided to say, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna leap off the top of this building and spontaneously sprout wings and fly away because hey, rules be damned," right? I might actually just surprise them that one time, turn around and say, "No, actually, there is this thing called the theory of gravity and laws of physics and so on. You're actually going to hit the ground really hard. Sorry, you're new character for you." So I'm not a complete anarchist in that way, just very nearly. Yeah, I'd say that's some of my general experience can be summed up as I have played everything from cavemen to ultra tech and sci-fi, and one of the game systems that I have always ended up going back to has always been White Wolf's World of Darkness in its myriad different forms. Be that as it may, I haven't played the 4th edition games. Please don't hang me for being one of the 4th edition fans, and if you happen to be a 4th edition fan, then I can't say I understand you, but that's your choice. Personally, I'm a 2nd edition fan first and foremost. 3rd edition I can do with 3rd edition, but I was weaned into World of Darkness on 2nd edition Vampire and 2nd edition Werewolf, and I'm going to always look at those as mommy and daddy when it comes to World of Darkness. Other than World of Darkness, I've played yeah, as I said, many different systems. I've played Chaosium's systems. I've played GURPS was my first major role-playing system that I really devoted time and effort to. Generic universal role-playing system, also amusingly enough, second edition. That's should give you guys some idea of just how old I am by now. Cough. I've played homemade systems. I've played systems that only a handful of people outside of my own immediate circle of friends would ever have heard of. As I said, I had a hand in some basic game design years and years ago, including a system called Visual Reality, which was created by a friend of mine and her husband. A very generic sort of role-playing game where you could play anything from an atom to a god if you wanted to. Literally, the rules were there. And and I've played, well, as it shows here, a lot of World of Darkness. I have to say that for me, World of Darkness presents something that I particularly like, in that it gives me as a storyteller a ready-made framework. I usually tend to see the World of Darkness as one of two things. You have two options if you want to be a storyteller in a World of Darkness game. Either you can go with the purely as written version of it, where you can get source books for any number of major cities around the world, usually the by night books, such as New York by night or Berlin by night, and that sort of thing. And these source books will present you with a very, very dismal and very dark and obviously very, very gothic version of the world we live in, and therefore twist it into the World of Darkness. Or you can do what I do, and what quite a few of my own contemporary generation of storytellers in this system did, at least when I started playing these games, was to take our own world and just tilt it 5, maybe 10 degrees, so that buildings would always look a little bit more run down. Cars would always be a little more likely to break down. There would be more crime in the streets. The nights were a little bit longer and a little bit darker that way, but it was still clearly recognizable as our own world, just more dystopic, more darker, basically. Yes, darker. So that is another classic way of handling World of Darkness. A song, Atara, is created based on this second method, that I take the world we live in and make it just that little bit nastier and that little bit darker. Once that is said, lastly, in terms of experience, I should mention that not only have I been role-playing for more than 30 years, but I have been a GM or a storyteller for 28 out of those 30 years. And like most other storytellers out there, I started out being horrible, bad, terrible, awful, having no idea what I was doing, being terrified of making any kind of mistake and not flowing with it, and over planning everything, or railroading players. And I think every storyteller, every GM out there who has got any kind of real experience under their belts will probably recognize at least parts of those things. It's a natural progression. You learn to you get better as years progress. As you get more experience, you get better at flowing with the unexpected. There is a saying here that always expect your characters or your players to go for option X when you've told them that they have option X, Y, or A, B, and C. If they have options A, B, and C, they're always going to go for X. They're never going to do what you expect of them. They're never gonna play by your pre-planned ideas. the way it's usually said, at least amongst many Danish role players that I've attended conventions with and known over the years, is that real role players always turn to the right. Let's go left. That's how it goes. One of the things you have to get good at in order to be a good storyteller or a good GM, at least as far as I'm concerned, is you have to be good at handling stuff like that on the fly. You have to be good at improvising. Because if you try to railroad your characters, they're going to feel that their agency is taken away from them. They're going to feel like they're bit players, and that, why am I even here? I'm not the one who's actually doing things. I'm being told by the game master, by the storyteller, what I am doing. This creates resentment pretty quickly in almost any role player out there. And if I can make that one early piece of advice really burn through the screens to anyone listening to this, it is, for goodness sakes, whatever you do, don't railroad your players. Let them create and experience their own fun. That's my personal opinion. You may disagree, but that's the way I see it. Anyway, on to A Song at Tara. Obviously, it's set in Dublin, the capital of Ireland. And as I've just mentioned earlier, I'm Danish. And if anybody out there so much as makes a bread-related joke there, I'm going to do something mean, nasty, and terrible to them, if I ever meet them. But obviously, it is a fair bit of mileage from Copenhagen, Denmark, to Dublin, Ireland. However, the reason for the plan, for the background for the campaign came in 2011, when I moved to Dublin for a period of 2.5 years. I got a job in the IT sector in Dublin and moved there for that reason. Quite a lot of people do that for one reason or another. Dublin is the IT capital of Europe. Most major international IT companies have their European headquarters in Dublin for a variety of reasons, and consequently I lived there for a while and got to know and love the city. Dublin is a wonderful place. I miss it quite frequently now that I don't live there anymore. And I realized while I was living there that this is a really good and somewhat unorthodox setting for not for a computer game. Nice. I'm sitting here looking at my computer screen and making mess ups like that. This is what I meant when I said I was going to cock all this up. No, for a role-playing game, obviously, because Dublin isn't a city of 15 million people like, for example, I don't know, New York or something similar, Tokyo, for example. It's not. Dublin is, as European capitals go, fairly small. It's got, as the Irish would say themselves, it's got 550,000 inhabitants during the night, and it's about 3 times as many during daytime hours because of commuters, people who come and go from the surrounding areas and who then end up working in Ireland. This also leaves Ireland in a slightly strange situation, namely that during daytime hours, fully 1/3 of the population is in their capital, working, or living, or going to school, or whatever. But about 1.4, 1.5 million Irishmen in Dublin during daytime hours, out of a total population of 4.5 million, means that the place feels pretty crowded. It feels like a bigger city than it is. At the same time, it's a place which is at a crossroads between the old and the new. Dublin is obviously the capital of Catholic country, primarily Catholic country, but it is also a country in which Catholicism is, because of a variety of real life issues, losing a lot of its former strength, in particular with younger people. So living there in the day and age we are in now means that you clearly get a feel of a culture which is changing actively all around you. This sort of thing, obviously, lends itself really, really well to something like a gothic horror kind of game, or any kind of dark setting for a role playing game. So I had that idea while I lived there. However, at the time, I didn't have a group to play with, and by the time I did find other role players to play with in Dublin, I was pretty much getting ready to go back to Denmark. So the plan was shelved until I got back here, where I am now, and I finally, after I got back to Denmark, I found a group of old friends that I could play with again, and we got things moving pretty quickly, but not in this direction. We played other systems, primarily Paizo's Pathfinder role-playing game, which is a fantasy game, and which obviously for that reason has no real-life connection in any way. That was the game that we were primarily playing, and we had a lot of fun with that in various campaigns. But after a while, I wanted to go back to World of Darkness, which is what I ended up basically suggesting to the others. As I said, I have an idea for a campaign. It's set in Dublin. Obviously, it's a place I now know, but most of you haven't seen or visited, so it gives me some inside knowledge that you guys don't have. And if they would be interested, and well, let's just say that the interest from some people seemed overwhelming, and from others, I got my wires crossed, because there was interest, but I misunderstood it as if there wasn't, which meant that I planned the campaign and then put it on the shelf for about a year, where my players ended up wondering why that campaign never materialized. When we finally got to talking about it and I found out that I had gotten my wires crossed, I immediately started getting ready and setting up. But this, of course, also meant I had plenty of time to plan it out. I knew what the premise of the story was going to be. I knew what kind of characters and what kinds of NPCs I would like to have there. And because people presenting me with an option, me personally, with an option of writing anything is asking for disaster, I sat down and wrote some brief fluff files that I sent to my players, totaling something like 50 pages. Because yeah, that's my idea of brief when it's in writing. And this did, at least I've been told by the players, this did help. Even though it was a lot to read, it helped give them a good grasp of the situation in the city. The way I wrote it was, I wrote it as a couple of text files created by two of the NPCs that, if you have listened to A Song at Tara, you will be able to recognize. One of the text files was written by Siobhan, in all her ragey glory, and the other file was written by Joseph, also known as Snickering Sneaker, the Polish ragabash. And this not only did it give them some information about NPCs and about setting and so on, but it also it gave them a feel for the tone of the campaign before the campaign had even started, because these two files were written in the language of these two NPCs respectively, in the way they would formulate things. So Siobhan's was full of rage and anger and half-veiled threats and bile, and Joseph's was more light-hearted and not taking anything particularly seriously. Right then and there, you have the difference between a typical ragabash and a typical Gayard. This, of course, also meant this is part of the what I call the execution of my planning stage here, is that I sent people these fluff files, and then I basically told them, read these, And in 3 weeks' time, or whenever, 3 weeks or a month, I can't remember now how long it was, I said, then we're going to get together and we're going to create characters. We're going to sit down, talk it over, figure out what you guys want to play. However, I said, please make sure that you read, at the end of one of these files, there is a list which sets down some limitations and some requirements for your characters. And as people who have listened to Session Zero can probably recall, or hopefully recall, one of the absolute demands was that I wanted one of every auspice in the pack. Gaillard, Thurge, Philodox, Rune, and Ragabash. I wanted one of each. Since there are 6 players, that isn't a problem. We just have one that there would be 2 off. I also made a grid where I said, okay, I don't want this combination of tribe and auspice, because I don't want things to get too stereotypical. Normally I don't put that kind of limitation on people, but I was dealing with a group of players, several of whom had not actually played World of Darkness games before. Consequently, I decided, and this was my call alone, that so that they don't get snared into playing the normal stereotypes that the games and that the rule books lend themselves to, such as, let's say, a Fina, a Rune, or Fina Gaillard, or Get a Fenris a Rune. That would just be a little bit too cookie cutter, and I wanted people to try to come up with something that was original and their own. In the end, it ended up with us having a Get a Fenris a Rune anyway, because Heine was smart enough to leverage my personal wish to see at least one Get a Fenris in the group against me, and then of course I ended up with 2 Get a Fenris anyway. So there you have it. That said, requirements on the characters obviously was something I looked into early on. I said, listen, you guys have not actually gained your first rank yet. You will start by playing out your first change. You are teenagers, you're even fairly early in your teens, and please do make characters that reflect that. So, don't overstat them, don't give them world-class athletic abilities at the age of 13. Don't give them, don't make them the next Garry Kasparov or the next Muhammad Ali at that age. Don't make them nuclear physicists with a doctorate from high-end university somewhere like that, because you start out being 13 or 14 years old. At the same time, I said I wanted one Fina, seeing as that is the primary tribe in Ireland. It's their island more than anything else. And as I already mentioned, I wanted one of each auspice, and then I let them decide between themselves what they wanted and offered what suggestions I thought I should at the appropriate times when it felt like they were getting stuck. Last thing I want to say about the characters as such is that I did ask them to remember the feel of the campaign, that we are dealing with a bunch of young people who take their first steps into something which is absolutely atrociously horrible and awful and dangerous, something which is indescribable to most people, something they think they might have seen in horror movies, but suddenly it turns out that the horror movies are real. And they've been really good at doing that by and large. I have to say they've come up with characters who reacted to their first change in very different ways, obviously, as is evident from the episodes already uploaded, and I should probably add here that at the time I'm recording this, 12 sessions have been uploaded. So their rite of passage is now complete, and they have earned their first rank. However, that was all up to the players, obviously. In the end, as a storyteller, player characters are the player's area and where they can go to town. This is obviously their primary method and means of interacting with the game world as a whole comes through what character they make. Everything they do in game is based on whether you made a 6'11", hairy teeth, unibrow, special ops soldier, or a 13-year-old schoolgirl. You probably see things through slightly different lenses depending on which of the two you play, but my job as the storyteller obviously is then to create the world in which they function and that they interact with. And for me, that starts with the NPCs. NPCs in my games, and in my opinion, have to be more than generic innkeeper number one and emotionless, flat background character number 16 without personality. Those kinds of characters are, generally speaking, not engaging, and it doesn't make people want to involve themselves. Obviously, I can't sit there and create 530,000 or even 1.5 million NPCs and keep them in order in my head. I'm experienced. I'm not insane. So I wouldn't even try. But they do interact with primary NPCs. There is a fairly significant number of NPCs with whom the player characters can have regular and major interactions. And my goal was to make sure that each of these NPCs got something resembling a distinct personality, some quirks, some oddities, some drives, some wants. Using the virtual tabletop that we use in our group, Roll20, allows you to make little notes on each of these NPC entries. So if I'm opening up, let's just start with Cat. This is her entry, and this is the image, the photo of her, or in this case of her back with the raven tattoo. And then there's quite a lot of text here, but Cat obviously is a very significant and very major NPC. However, if you look down here at the bottom, it says GM notes only visible to GM. Now, obviously, there are no notes on Cat, so I can show this safely. But several of the other NPCs have notes added down here. It's just for my own benefit, really. The players wouldn't be able to see those, obviously, if they open up such a thing. But it's down there I would be able to add if the NPC in question had some hidden motives or some greater goal that they work towards that the players weren't aware of. And in that way, I don't have to constantly keep 50, 60, 100 NPCs neatly filed in my own head. In that way, a virtual tabletop like this is actually a great help to a storyteller. And personally, at least, I have to say, I think this at least for the immediate future's sake, this is the future of role-playing. Sitting around a table, playing tabletop, pen and paper role-playing is fantastic and fun, and it'll always be a thing for at least some of us, but I do think this is going to be an increasing part of role playing. But just to get back to the NPCs here, I had some requirements and some limitations and some feel for these, just like I had for the characters. I needed NPCs that could fulfill certain roles. I needed some that could be primary antagonists. I needed some that could be secondary antagonists. I needed allies. I needed filler, quite frankly, people who are just there and who are neither antagonists or protagonists or even allies, unless the player characters interact with them and through their actions either make them allies or antagonists. So I needed to come up with a fairly extensive gallery of people from the get-go. I'm weird with things like that. I actually like making NPCs even if they may never see the light of day in the campaign. Not everyone does that, I know that. But the way I see it, that kind of roster of NPCs that I have here, and I'm just gonna open up everything and just scroll down so you can have a look at the numbers so far. Each of these is an NPC, and yeah, obviously there are a lot of them. Not everyone would create anywhere near that many, and I wouldn't venture to say that it has to that anybody has to do that. But it helps me, and it might help others, and I believe it can help the players by making them feel like they are in a position, in a setting where people are real. The NPCs come across as real people with real interactions, and very explicitly, people that do things off screen. I will occasionally, between two game sessions, I will go in here and I will edit one of these files by adding something to the file that this NPC has done since the last time we played, which the player characters would then have learned of in the meantime or heard of in the meantime, so that these NPCs have a little bit of a life of their own, even if the player characters never actually encounter them, because it helps create an immersive setting. And these are some of the requirements I had. I also needed, obviously, furthermore, for requirements, I needed both antagonists and allies of different power levels. The characters obviously start out being weak only insofar as they are untrained, but no werewolf is ever weak in the world of darkness. They're all massively powerful beasts. The weakest human, as I will usually say it, has 1 dot of strength, and then when he goes into Krenos, he will have 5 dots of strength and suddenly be as strong as the strongest human alive. So, however you go about it, werewolves are powerful beasts. That also means that some of their allies are going to be mind-numbingly powerful, and some of their antagonists are going to be despairingly hard to get rid of. And that's the way it should be. I don't necessarily believe that every NPC that they run into should have a power level comparative to what the players do. It's okay for them to meet allies or even enemies who are much stronger or even much weaker than they are at different times, so long as they aren't put in a catch-22 situation where the players are, let's just say that they were on their, let's say that on session 3, they were suddenly faced with the full wrath of Clan MacAlpin, with every single Black Spiral Dancer under that clan's control, um, in in open combat. That would have been a very one-sided butchery, and the players would have sat there afterwards numbed, feeling, why the hell did you just slaughter us for no reason? But that's not to say that they couldn't meet one of these characters. Then it's suddenly a matter of, how do we avoid getting killed by this incredibly powerful thing? As a storyteller, it's important to, at least I believe, it's important to always know your players so that you can create situations like that where they won't be out of their depth, but at the same time where they will feel challenged. Don't make it too easy and don't make it too hard on them, but give them ways out. And more than anything else, if they come up with an intelligent and plausible way of getting out of a bad situation, then never mind what I had planned. Good role playing, good planning should be rewarded, as far as I'm concerned. I don't want to kill their creativity by saying, no, you can't do that, unless it really would make absolutely bog all sense that they do it. I'd much rather adjust my plans and my stories so that they have a feeling of being the main characters in the movie called The Fated Six, in this case. And this also means that I have to limit my characters, or my NPCs. Obviously, I have to. I could, as I said before, I could have on session 3 let them run into the entirety of Clan MacAlpin and just had them slaughter the entire group. But while that might be the obvious way of doing it, that creates, well, for one thing, it would end the campaign right then and there. But moreover, the players are not my enemies. As a storyteller, my job is not to fight the players. This is something that I know at least a lot of younger and more inexperienced storytellers or GMs struggle with. I've seen it. I've even been there many years ago. That initially it very much feels like it is a player versus storyteller sort of situation, but it's not. It's a cooperation. The storyteller does know what happens when the players turn around the next corner because he or she has already planned it. But then the players will still give that their own twist and make things go their way. They might not even turn around the next corner. They might turn around where they stand and go into the mall instead. So all the storyteller's plans are then negated because the players have done something completely different than what was expected. The idea, the end goal in my book of any role-playing group is to create a good story in which both players and storyteller have fun. The only reason to play these games is to have fun. And if that is not true for both the players and the storyteller, something has failed along the way. It is possible to have fun for a storyteller without slaughtering their players' characters all the time, and it's possible to still challenge them. Player character death is a thing. It can happen in my campaigns as well. I don't like it when it happens, but I don't believe in fudging dice. If characters do something that would get them killed and the dice fall in a way that does get them killed, they die. It very nearly happened at the end of the Rite of Passage, where Connell was extremely close to biting the big one and heading off to the great big kennel in the sky. It didn't happen because werewolves are notoriously difficult to kill, but it got really, really close. So yes, that sort of thing can happen, and it has to be something both the players and the storyteller are aware of and accept. It's not something to strive for, however. Don't deliberately try to kill off your characters. If you do that, you are treating them not like people with whom you are creating a story. You are treating them like enemies, and that isn't conducive to a good role-playing experience for everyone involved. So yeah, those are the some of the limitations on NPCs as I see it. Make them challenging, but don't necessarily let that challenge be a matter of, oh, can we beat him up in a straight up fight? Well, maybe they can't beat him up in a straight up fight, but then maybe because there are 6 of them and one of the enemy, they can run circles around him or outthink him because he might be big and strong, but he's, well, dumb. There's always going to be some way for the players to imagine their way out of a situation. If you create a situation to begin with where the player characters, simply cannot win, if you create a must-lose scenario, they're unlikely to want to come back and play with you again, because that isn't satisfying. On the other hand, if you make it too easy, then what's the challenge? Then there isn't much fun in that either. So it's about finding that balance. Lastly, I will say about my NPCs is that I wanted, for this particular campaign, I wanted a certain feel to them. And I wanted a certain feel to several of them, so that, for example, the Get of Fenris in Dublin were angry, but as the story has played out, also as it's been proven, they were also largely misunderstood. The Bone Gnawers are outcasts as they are anywhere in the world, really, but they were also, at least some of them, were actually quite well liked. And the Fina, the local werewolves in power when the whole thing began, are very traditional and very bound up on how things have been done always. And these are all fairly stereotypical, fairly stereotypical views of these groups. So in order for them to actually have a personality, I wanted to add a little bit extra to them. For example, you have Kat and Eric, to go back to the Get of Fenris, where Kat is more scheming than most people and more devious and politically minded than most people normally associate with the Get of Fenris, whereas Eric is big, strong, massively powerful, has obscene amounts of rage, and is by and large out of control, which is what people expect of the Get of Fenris, except he then breaks down some of the stereotypes by supporting Kat for Alpha, despite the fact that she's a female and she's not an Arun. So give each of them this little bit of twist in order to keep them interesting, and in some ways to keep the players guessing as to motivations about these characters or NPCs. And as the story has then progressed over the course of this rite of passage story that they've now been told, they've gotten to know several of these NPCs fairly well, and have grown to either trust or distrust them. And in some cases, such as with Kat, for example, some players trust her. In fact, some people trust her very implicitly, whereas others are a lot more reserved and a lot more uncertain of whether they can actually trust her and her motives. This is absolutely okay. It's not my job to tell the players how they should feel about an NPC. It's their job to make up their own mind about them. I can only present the NPC in a certain way. Lastly, on this recording, I would like to talk a little bit about locations. As I said, I used to live in Dublin, Ireland for about 2.5 years. Consequently, I know the city reasonably well. I lived personally on the south side of Dublin, which is generally speaking, considered to be the nicer part of Dublin. Um, Mostly because as soon as you cross north of the Liffey, then well, I had a colleague who turned up for work one day telling us, ashen faced, that she'd gotten out of her front door and headed down to the elevator. She'd gone down. She'd been just about to open the door and head out into the street when she'd realized there was a dead person sitting next to the door who had OD'd during the night. That's the difference between Dublin North and Dublin South. Obviously, that's a pretty extreme example, but yeah. I could have let the players run riot all over the city during the course of their rite of passage, but I thought personally that it was smarter and wiser to give them a few locations that they felt they knew really, really well, such as St. Stephen's Green, such as Hotel de Marker, such as a few other places where they spent quite a lot of time. They would also have a few locations that they would know of but not actually be familiar with themselves, most noticeably Temple Bar, because Temple Bar in this game is completely and utterly run and controlled by the local leeches or vampires, who are the arch enemies of the werewolves, and therefore being a werewolf in Temple Bar is a serious health hazard. So yeah, I set up a few locations like that where most of the game plays out, at least as part of the initial rite of passage storyline, in order to give them that fundamental base of knowledge. Now that the rite of passage story is over, they are a lot more free to go and explore on their own, and they probably will, and I'm looking forward to it, and I'm sure that they're going to test my knowledge of the place quite heavily. If one of you who's listening here should happen to be Irish, or some of you happen to be Irish, please do not kill me if I do screw up on that. Also, please do not kill me for my Irish accent. I'm told it's not that horrible. However, the locations the locations were picked and planned because they were easy to find information on. This is something I can only recommend to other storytellers as well. Pick locations that you can, even if you run the game in a city, in a location that you are familiar with, even if your players are very familiar with it. Let's say that you just so happen to live in, I don't know, let's say you live in London, and all of your players also live in London, and you want to run a World of Darkness game set in London. Excellent. By all means, it's a fantastic city to run such games in. So please go ahead and do that, but make sure that any location that you let your players get to and involve themselves with at any to any extent, any let's say they want to go to the Millennium Dome. The Millennium Dome is easy to find information on. It's one of the most famous venues in London today. It's easy to find stuff on. Not a problem. However, if you had been playing with players, with friends who were not familiar with the Millennium Dome because they'd never been to London, then for them to be able to go onto the internet and look up information easily makes it more easy for them to get into the spirit of things. They can more easily relate to the location when they are able to find millions of photos of the place and maybe even a few film clips of it, and they can read hundreds of pages about what it's like and what it looks like and so on. That it simply makes it easier. For that reason, I can also heartily recommend using Google Maps, because you can literally look at Street View, so you can give people a very good idea of what does it actually look like to stand in this position, in this in this setting. This is something I expect to do going forward in this campaign as well. Obviously, all I'm saying now, these are just my personal pieces of advice. Feel free to disregard any of it if you don't like it. But of course, now that I had my base locations, the trick, and this will be the final point I make here, the trick is, as I mentioned early on, is to turn it World of Darkness, is to give it that little bit of a tilt so that it comes across as dark and run down and dangerous and inherently unfriendly. And this can be difficult with some locations because some cities are friendly. Dublin, at least Dublin South, for example, is a friendly city. It's a welcoming city. It's the Irish are very, very open-minded, open-hearted people. I was received there as a foreigner extremely well. In 2.5 years of living in Dublin, I had exactly one person say anything negative about the fact that I came to Dublin to steal a job. He did get kind of quiet when I asked him or told him that he was welcome to have it if he spoke Danish, which was a requirement. Other than that, the Irish were welcoming, and the city felt friendly. It felt like if you went out, you were safe, and people wouldn't be lurking around the next corner to assault you. Now, obviously, Dublin is not a perfect city, and crime happens in real life like it does everywhere else. But there is a feel to a place, and when you want to turn something World of Darkness, you have to be able to take such a positive feeling and make it somehow threatening. People have to feel that if they go out, there could be, in this case, a Fomor standing around the next corner with an AK-47 loaded with silver bullets. That's the thing that has to weigh on everyone's mind. And how each of you do that is obviously entirely up to you. My suggestion is to, when people interact with the setting, not so much with people, but with the setting as such, make sure to always describe it as, I don't know, sad is perhaps not the right word, but run down and slightly decrepit. There's one example that happened between 2 game sessions where Taryn was feeling very depressed because of something that had happened. And between game sessions, I sat down with the player and told her how some of the other guru in the set would have helped to cheer her up. And one of the ways they did that was that Siobhan had, with whom Taryn then subsequently developed a very friendly relationship, had taken her to a place on Pierce Street, where an old archive building, while I was still in Dublin, was set up for as one major massive Pong game, like the old, really old school Atari game Pong, was literally set up so that you could play it on the facade of this building from across the street, and it was like that for a month. And Siobhan took Taryn to this place and had somehow arranged it so that they had a whole night where this Pong game was reactivated, so they could play Pong on the facade of the of this building. And as I was sitting there talking to Taryn's player about it, I believe I managed, at least it was my impression afterwards, that I managed to give her this impression that this is a moment of fun in a setting and a city which is normally quite bleak and dismal, and where something like that would be, you wouldn't see that normally. You wouldn't have that kind of fun in the streets, because that kind of thing would not be would be an absolute exception, and for that reason, that one short moment of fun for this one player got a little bit of extra weight to it, and subsequently it led to a real friendship forming between Terran and the NPC Siobhan, and that is that's something that I think in a World of Darkness campaign is extremely important to remind people, that they are in a world that might look like ours, but as soon as you scratch the paint, it's rusty underneath. In the end, World of Darkness means that it's not a very nice world. Bad things happen. I think, as a word of advice, what I would say is, if you are running a game in a World of Darkness setting, if you have a situation with a 50-50 percentage chance of coming out good or coming out bad, in a World of Darkness setting, you should always let it go bad. In a World of Darkness setting where you have a 60-40, where the 60 is the likelihood of something positive coming off a situation, and the 40 being the chance of something bad coming off a situation, you should still, more often than not, let something bad come of a situation. Let the victories the players have be significant, but let them have enough defeats along the way that they know to treasure the victories. In this situation, their rite of passage started out with one of the most beloved NPCs from the very early setting dying, and another NPC who had been very helpful to one of the player characters also getting killed. This is a serious blow. This is something that would tear the heart out of any person who experienced it. Because of that, when they finally got their revenge, it was all the sweeter. And that, in my opinion, is what World of Darkness is all about. Those are some of my thoughts on the campaign as a whole. I'm probably going to make a few more videos like this as time progresses, on going into a bit more detail about NPCs, for example, would be an idea. In such a situation, I would open up some of them and explain my rationale behind creating this or that NPC in this or that way. However, these are some of my thoughts about this campaign, which I am now running for these players. I hope you've enjoyed it. Please do feel free to leave a comment. If you absolutely hated it, leave a comment as well, but please be nice about it. And I will see you all, hopefully, for more of these and for more episodes of A Song Atara. Thank you very much.